what I've got now, I've got two spreadsheets, but I'll use the first one, and then hopefully near the end, I'll flip over to the second one, because that will help just to illustrate to some questions that Maurice raised prior to this meeting about affordable housing and how it affects value. And I can then demonstrate how policy, overall policy, including affordable housing, affects land value by using a methodology that is used by His Majesty's Treasury, HM Treasury, what we call the Green Book valuation. And what I've done is I've written a spreadsheet which basically mimics the calculations that are done by government about the impact of government on markets. And this is really quite an eye-opener in terms of the power of policy, and the recognizing that government recognizes that it does affect the way markets operate, but for very good reasons. What the Treasury is concerned is that they only want to intervene where there's a need to intervene in the market, to improve the way the market works. And there is an acceptance, of course, that policies in the local plan have a cost, and those costs are legitimate, including the delivery of affordable housing on sites by developers. So let me just open this spreadsheet. This is, I'll just flick it to, there's like an instruction at the front of the spreadsheet, which basically just says that it's a fairly, it's not an advanced, it's a basic introduction to appraisal, development appraisal. And the appraisal methodology in this case is the residual land value. Okay, so it's the methodology that's set out in MPPF, which have to be followed if applicants want to contest viability. And if you look at the third paragraph, what we're doing is we're trying to find out how much is left in the budget to buy the land. So the valuation is a guess, a good guess in terms of the data. The outputs from the appraisal are as good as and they're based upon the veracity of time and effort that you put into corroborating the inputs. And when I do this sort of work for clients, the value side of the calculation, I spent probably 65% of my time looking at value. What is something is worth? Where do I get the data from? Because it's the biggest number in the calculation. That's where you should spend most of your time. Is it really worth that amount of money? What are the transactions? Not the offer prices that come from Zoopla or other data sets, but the actual prices that are transacted in your local area. So we need to actually get some really good data, and that takes time and effort. The cost side of construction, there are better data sets around, and because I work in a university, again, I can use commercial data sets, and the one that is usually cited by appraisal workers is Building Cost Information Service, which is owned by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and that's panel data, which is basically collects data on schemes, and they basically collect that and then readjust it to current prices. So it's really like travel data that sometimes you fill in a form when you travel on an aircraft on holiday. It's just data that's put up into the system, and it's then reassessed in terms of current price, and then we can adjust it for local circumstance. So there's two spreadsheets, a residual one, a residual residential, and then there's a residual one for commercial. And the reason why I've differentiated them is because the metrics, the calculations you make are quite different for commercial compared to residential. So if we just flip into here, if you look at, we've got some notes on the right-hand side. And these are sort of standard statements of the sorts of things that you would allow. And again, they're set as percentages, but we can see the numbers in terms of what it actually generates. We've got the price, the transaction price that we think we're going to be wanting to sell the asset. We're going to produce 20 houses. We generate a sum of £6 million. For instance, if in fact the developer thinks that actually we can get £320,000, then you can see very quickly it generates another sum and clearly changes the calculation. If in fact they overestimate the price and in fact they can only sell them for 228,000, then of course it again has an impact upon the actual biggest sum in the calculation, the gross development value. So having clarity about what something is worth and what it will sell at is really, really important, because that is the biggest sum. That will always be the biggest sum in the calculation if we want to get an idea of what a site is worth. And now we've got some costs. These are expressed in pounds per square meter, and we know how big they are. So 20 90 square meter homes. I don't know if you know, but the average size of a new home in England and Wales is just under 80 square meters. Okay, we've got nationally prescribed housing standards, and that's important in terms of whether the affordable housing that is being built meets those requirements. The registered providers and the councils and the housing associations will only get support from Homes England if the units that they receive meet national prescribed housing standards, and the minimum size is 60 square meters. So again, it's really important that when you look at a scheme, you make sure that the affordable housing is actually being delivered at that sort of scale. If we go down the spreadsheet to the cost side here, we've got not only the sort of the footprint of the development, we've also now got external works. So all the costs beyond the footprint of the building. So it's the pavements, it's the street furniture, it's the roads and so on. So again, all those have got to be delivered at a standard, and we tend to use, depending on the type of development, depending upon the nature of the site. A greenfield site, you'd need to have more infrastructure compared to a brownfield site. A brownfield site tends to be within the urban boundary, and therefore the scale of development will tend to be lower, and therefore the numbers will be different. I've just chosen 10% as an illustration. We've got fees that have to be paid. These are to ensure that what gets built, the thing stands up. So it's architects' fees, building surveyors' fees, engineers' fees, and so on. And then, of course, we've got finance, which, remember, when we do the calculations, irrespective of where the money comes from, we assume, and the developers assume, that they borrow all the money from a third party, or they borrow all the money from themselves and pay a sum, they charge themselves a rate of interest. And therefore, that's what is called the opportunity cost of capital. So all the costs of borrowing money, we assume we're going to borrow all the money, 100%, and that is a cost which we carry against the development. And we do that in terms of price, 6% per annum, over a particular period of time. We allowed for a void period. After the period of when we built the scheme, and until we get off the site, we have to finance the scheme. So we allow that. And then, of course, we've got profit. We've got profit on the costs, and we set that as a line. We generate that sort of sum of money. And of course, we've got, and we can express that in two ways. So when you read things, it's important to know the reference point for profit. If they say, oh, well, we're only getting 15% profit, 15% of what? If it's 15%, in this case, 60.6% of GDV is a big number. And if you look at the costs are a lower number. So again, it's really important to look at actually how you express profit. Often they say it's percentage of turnover, which is GDV, gross development value. Or we want to think about in terms of all the costs that we incur. So we express that. It's the same number, £1 million, but it's a percentage of that for GDV, and it's a percentage of the total cost in terms of that figure there. And what we've got at the bottom is the money to buy the land. But that's the money that's available at the end of the development after 1.5 years, 1.25 years. So we've got to bring that figure back to the present day. And so what we do is we do a discounting and we adjust the figure to the present day calculation. And that's the amount of money we've got to buy the land. It's not the land price, it's the budget that the developer's got to buy the land. And so long as they don't overpay the figure, they'll collect their £1 million profit if they get off the site, and everything else remains the same. So what we tend to do is we can use this spreadsheet to say what happens if we change things. So as I did before, if we get £20,000 per unit more, then of course the GDV goes up. And of course, our budget has gone up by a very large amount. And we can express that as a percentage of the change to get an idea of how powerful the change in value is. If we put that back to where we are, so again, it's so simple to do as long as you know what you're changing and have in your head the direction of change that you think is going to happen. So if you've got more value on the site, nothing else changes, the site is worth more. If the value of the site, if the value of the asset you're creating goes down, then we know, before we even look at the number below, that the budget for the land has gone down. And it's gone down by a lot. So getting the price there, getting that, that's why I say it's such a powerful variable that if you get the number wrong and then you overpay for land, then you trade in profit. And developers don't like doing that. But we know from the data we got from FAME is that many of the developers are actually getting supernormal profit. So they're getting probably £320,000 and paying much less than that figure there, and they can put that figure, the residual, onto their profits. So they can deliver their supernormal profit. So again, it's just a matter of you looking at the numbers and saying, well, is that right? Where's that number come from? If you go and read the documents produced by the consultants, they will tend to put in tons and tons of data, mainly to try and distract you from the devil of the detail. And what you've got to be able to do is to really look for where you think there's area of mistruth and misquoting. In terms of costs, again, we can think about what happens if the costs rise. They say actually it's not £1,750 per square metre, it's £1,950 per square metre. Again, has a massive impact on the land value. So what we're saying is that we need to have good evidence on prices. We need to have good evidence on costs. because these are the two big numbers that affect the land value. If we change the price of money, say to 7 for both items, it doesn't change the land value very much, just by a fraction. So if the price of money changes, remember it's gone up from 6 percentage points to 7 percentage points. So that's a big increase. That's sort of 13%. Okay. What happens if it goes up to 10? Which is nearly, now it's starting to have an impact. Actually, what happens if it's doubled to 12? Then it's starting to have a big impact. But the price of money doubling is an unusual event. It goes up by 1% to 2%, but not by very large numbers. Okay, so we can see the power of some of these variables. Okay, and that's the purpose of the appraisal. It basically allows you to experiment, but you need to understand where you want to experiment. Spend your time on value, spend your time on costs, because they're the biggest numbers. Okay, now if we flip to this commercial one of the things you notice, hopefully you do notice, is that we've got different metrics. We express commercial development, the retail shop, the office that might be built as part of your development, and we express them in terms of rent per square meter and a yield. Okay, and it's these two inputs there that generate a gross development value in terms of size, 160 square meters, rent, and yield. Now, what does this actually mean? Well, it means that a developer will not begin to build a commercial development unless you've got somebody willing to sign a lease and occupy the space and pay the rent on entry. So this is a presumption that somebody's prepared to pay £200 per square meter at a yield of 7%. And the yield is the probability of them not paying the rent at any one point in time. Okay, so if we know that, let's say it's the co-op wants a small local supermarket, a corner shop, they're likely to be paid the rent week in, week out to occupy the space they want to provide their service. And so we know that their yield is going to be about 5. And therefore, there's lesser chance of them not paying the rent. And there, by definition, the value has gone up. If it's 7%, the value of the asset's gone down because there's a greater chance that these who've signed the lease may not pay the rent 7 times out of 100. We know that in some places it's 10%. And can you see what's happening to the value of the asset? If the place is attracting yields which are now nearly twice as high as the first, we start with 10, now we start with 7, now it's 10. That's 10 times out of 100, you're not going to collect the rent. So the asset is worth less as the yield goes up. So I say to my students, when you go into the town centres, particularly into your local centre, they'll tend to have a yield much lower than places which might be just in an area where there is low population. I know places in the UK, for instance, in Grimsby. I don't know if anybody's been to Grimsby. You've got 70% of the shops in Grimsby are empty. And the yield on those shops are greater than 20. So they're worth very, very little. the value of the asset now goes down enormously. So the yield is a really powerful variable. Okay. And of course, if nobody's paying any rent, then the asset is worth nothing in real terms, and the development wouldn't proceed. So development in commercial terms is all about knowing if it's going to be occupied. And the development will not start unless a lease has been signed. And so the actual process of development, particularly with respect to commercial, is very staccato. You might build a shop, an office, but only every 10 years. Not every week, every year that we do housing. So the data sets for the commercial sector are really less robust, less unreliable, more unreliable. Okay. And the data that you do get is often out of date. And so what I say to you is that if you actually have to do any work where you have to include non-residential development, particularly where you've got retail, offices, and so on, and you go and get some data from the local agent, and you say, well, I would always say, well, go to 3 agents locally, and they'll have a view of the world. And what happens if one says, actually, oh, the yield's 5% for shops in this area, and the other agent says, oh, actually, it's 6%, and another agent says it's 7%. What the hell are you going to do? Who do you believe? What I would argue is that what you do is you appraise the scheme using each of those different inputs to see whether, in fact, it materially matters whether, in fact, you choose 4, 5, or 6. If you actually, when you do your work, you get some kind of view that the market is similar, they all come out with, oh, it's 7%, then you're probably actually on a good wicket and saying, well, actually, well, okay, if they're all saying it's 7%, well, let's take it at 7%. But I would always still check what happens if it's 6 or if it's 8. Okay? Because that's a powerful variable, these numbers are really important. Okay? The rest of that spreadsheet, in the costs, are exactly the same as the residential. Cost per square meter, external works, all the fees, the finance, and so on. So it's a similar calculation, but it's just the value side of it is different. Now, in terms of affordable housing, Maurice, what we'll find is that the affordable housing for rent is expressed like this: rents and yield. Okay, so we apply a slightly different set of metrics for the affordable housing for rent. And if you are build for rent, for instance, we would express it like this as well. So the metrics and the mathematics are slightly more complex compared to the standard build for sale properties, whether it's affordable for sale or market for sale. So when we look at and when we do large housing schemes, when we include affordable housing, we actually have to, as it were, embrace these calculations in our housing schemes. So it's the very same process. And we actually have to know what the rents are going to be, and we need to know the yield, the chances of not collecting the rents. And we actually do know what the yield we use in these calculations. For affordable homes for rent and social rent, it's 6.25%.